Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, good morning, good day, everyone, and welcome. My name is Barbara Marchito. I'm the head of country analysis at EIB Economics Department, and I'm delighted to be here today for the launch of a report that is the outcome of more than 2 years of work of our teams at the EIB, together with colleagues from the World Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And I would also like to thank the ERS for their warm hospitality. It's been virtual, unfortunately, but exceptionally warm. So thank you very much for having us today. And before we kick off the discussion, just a couple of announcements. Translation in Arabic is available, and the event is being recorded and live streamed on the YouTube channel of the ERS. The analysis that we are about to present is based on enterprise survey data that Ebrd, the World Bank, and the EIB collected together. And let me just spend a couple of words on this quite unique set of data. These are micro firm level data representing the views of the managers of the firms on the ground. We've asked them what are the challenges that they face in running their businesses on a daily basis, and also the opportunities that they see going forward. And what is more, it's a data set that is fully available for everyone to use, from researchers to NGOs, IFIs, policymakers, donors. It's a truly public good. And that's what we have done together with the World Bank and the Ebrd. We have used this wealth of information to deepen and strengthen our understanding of the private sector in the MENA region. And so with no further ado, I leave the floor to Lionel Paille, who is the Director of Operations in the EU neighborhood at the EIB, to kick off the discussion with some opening remarks. Thank you very much, Lionel, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Barbara, and good afternoon to everyone. And good morning. I would like to extend to all participants a warm welcome to this event on behalf of the European Investment Bank. We are really pleased to share today the report Unlocking Sustainable Private Sector Growth in the Middle East and North Africa. And as indicated by my colleagues, this is actually the result of several years of research and collaboration among the EIB, Ebrd, and the World Bank to better understand the constraints to private sector development in this region. So let me first thank my colleagues from EIB, colleagues from Ebrd and World Bank for the outstanding work that they have achieved, and the excellent report that will be presented to you today. Micro, small, medium enterprising are the backbone of the economy. They contribute substantially to both employment creation and inclusive economic growth. At the same time, we can also witness that they foster competition, innovation in many economic sectors. Now, in the southern and eastern Mediterranean countries, SMEs represent a majority of firms, so actually 80 to 90% of total businesses in most countries. This represents approximately 20 million entities. If we look at jobs, and again, some statistics, they account for between 50 and 75% of total employment. So this is really key economic actors in this region, in these countries. That said, a number of obstacles continue to hinder the development of SMEs, and more broadly, private sectors in MENA region, which means that part of the potential for employment creation remains untapped, and this is something to be tackled. Now, access to finance is one of the greatest challenges. 63% of the MSMEs do not have access to financial resources from the banking financial sector. It is estimated in terms of financial gap to 240 billion US dollars, so a significant gap of financing for these players. Overall, the finding is that the financing of SMEs is restricted by the lack of enabling environments. Now, we can also mention regulations, which are still to be modernized, financial infrastructure, which needs to be strengthened, financial transparency, which needs to be encouraged, and many other factors. Banks, financial institutions in the MENA region are also not always fully equipped to offer sustainable, profitable SME banking products. So in this context, this is why the European Commission actually decided to launch a dedicated economic investment plan for the EU southern neighbors to strengthen resilience, to build prosperity, and to increase trade and investment in the region. From an EIB perspective, we actually dedicated more than 50% of our investment in recent years to support private sector development in the region. And we really intend to continue playing an active role in rolling out new EU mandates which are dedicated to the private sector. So this will enable us to continue supporting dynamic ecosystems, having a comprehensive toolbox to incentivize private investment. And ultimately, this will contribute to job creation, in particular for young people. Please consider this study that will be presented today as an instrument to address MSME's constraints, challenges, a powerful instrument as well to design new adequate responses in terms of financial support, in terms of technical advice, but also, of course, for the necessary regulatory evolutions and reforms. To conclude, I would like to stress that providing financing to MSMEs can be a profitable business. Returns are often based on a risk-return basis. And of course, our role as EIB, as lead financing institutions with Ebrd and World Bank, is to crowd in private investors and demonstrate the positive impact of our collective actions in the medium to long term. So I really wish that we have fruitful exchanges on investment opportunities today. I thank you, and I wish you all a very interesting session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lionel. I would like now to leave the floor to Farid Balaj, if he managed to join, Vice President for Middle East and North Africa at the World Bank. Farid, are you here?
Barbara, unfortunately, the link for Farid did not work out, and he had a window of 10 minutes, which we now lost, and he sends his deepest regrets. But I know what he would have said. He would have spoken about how the Ukraine war has really sent the shockwaves throughout our region in a way that was unexpected, and it was dramatic because of the compounding of the pandemic shock. How well the private sector can react to this shock is fundamental for the rebound and then eventually the recovery of the region. What we have done with this report is something that provides a very useful baseline and a deep understanding of what is happening in the private sector. And I know that he would have praised the collaboration between the Ebrd, the EIB, and the World Bank, because at this time, and I can witness this on my own, from my own personal experience, has been extraordinary in terms of intellectual contribution, willingness to work well together, and making something happen that ex ante didn't necessarily look like a slam dunk. The enterprise survey is a tremendous resource of knowledge and indication for policy advice. So I know that with me, Farid would hope that this is going to be the beginning of advertising this public good that is out there for researchers and policymakers, and also an opportunity today for us jointly with the audience to reflect on the challenges that continue to persist in the Middle East and North Africa private sector, and how political will and smart intervention can make it happen in these difficult times. So again, many regrets on Ferid's side, but all the support in terms of this work moving forward in our institution and hopefully with partners all over the region. So over to you, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Roberta. We're sorry that Ferid couldn't make it, but thanks for stepping in and sharing his thoughts and his words with us. I think it's time now to unveil the findings of the report, and the list of colleagues who have spent time and effort on this joint venture is very long, and I am afraid I won't be able to name them all, but I would like to at least mention the report coordinators, Helena Schweiger, Asif Islam, and Frank Bess. And Sergei Guriev. Professor Guriev has been a real driving force behind this report, connecting the dots between the many relevant questions that the teams have explored in a series of 9 working papers, which are also published today, and that really underpin this chapeau report. Sergei, I leave the floor to you to present our key findings, and I would like to also invite the audience to post their comments and questions in the chat, or to just raise your hand to get the floor during the Q&A that will follow the panel discussion. Thank you very much, and Sergei, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Thanks, Leonel, and I'm sorry we didn't get to hear from Ferid, but thank you, Roberta. Thank you for organizing this event. Indeed, it's a very impressive effort of cooperation between 3 institutions, and thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this venture. So as Barbara has said, it's a unique project where we collected data, mostly before COVID, but also during COVID, from many countries, including 6 countries in the region, where we surveyed firms and we looked at the drivers of firms' growth, firm performance, and their green investment from all kinds of angles. So as Barbara mentioned, there are 9 research papers, and what we are going to talk about today, what I'm going to present in the remaining 14 minutes, is the chapeau report, which synthesizes the takeaways from those 9 research papers. So basically, what we are talking about is in this report, in the chapeau report, 7 chapters, where we talk about the drivers of accumulating the factors of production. We talk about productivity of those factors, to what extent various drivers of productivity of capital and human capital make them more effective in improving firm performance. We talk about politics and governance. We talk about management practices. We talk about trade and innovation. We talk about digitization. And so this is the wealth of the report I'm going to talk about now. But before going there, let's again remind ourselves about the grim reality we are facing because of the war in Ukraine. War in Ukraine is a great tragedy with probably tens of thousands already dead and being killed as we speak. It's also an economic tragedy for Ukraine, where various institutions suggest that Ukrainian GDP will collapse this year by 30 to 50%, and probably $100 billion of infrastructure has already been destroyed. But it, of course, has repercussions beyond Ukraine and Russia. It contributes to higher prices for food and fuel, and slowdown in global GDP. And of course, it has impact on the region, on the MENA region. We are talking about the downgrade of growth forecast by about 1 percentage point in 2022. We talk about higher inflation because of food and energy prices, of course, and of course, deterioration of current account, because most of these countries are importing energy and food. So in that sense, people remember what happened 10 years ago when we had the previous food crisis. In a sense, there are all reasons to be worried about potential social unrest. So this is not just a tragedy for Ukraine, it's also a time of turbulence for MENA region. So coming back to the report, I should say that the report, even before the war and even before the pandemic, produced a lot of causes for concern. And one of those was public debt. So if you think about the macroeconomic situation, this is what the report starts with. We describe the macroeconomic backdrop for the analysis of firm performance. One thing which jumps out at you is that after the global financial crisis, the public debt in the region has increased dramatically. Why does that matter? That matters because that reduces fiscal capacity. That undermines the ability to respond to crises like the crisis during COVID and the crisis today. And that means that if you want to raise incomes, you need to think about private firms becoming more effective, more competitive, growing faster, and creating opportunities for income growth. And in that sense, the need for firms to become more productive is right there. This chart tells you that the report is very, very relevant because economic growth cannot come from massive expansion of public debt because it's already very high. So we start with various factors that affect productivity. We talk about governance, we talk about informal sector, and we know that this is the region where informal sector matters. We compare the challenges regarding informal sector to other regions, including ECA region, upper middle income countries in ECA region, lower middle income countries in ECA region. And basically what we are saying is governance is quite an issue, and a lot of firms have political connections, and we show that political connections matter. So the firms that have political connections do better than the outsiders, and that of course creates a problem because that eliminates the level ground field and therefore undermines incentives to invest in productivity growth for firms that come to the markets. Now, the other challenge in terms of governance is informality. Again, we show that in some of the countries in the region, informal sector matters. Our analysis is analysis of formal private sector firms. And for them, the challenge is the competition from informal sector. And basically, we show that this factor matters. Firms that face the pressure from informal sector are more likely to grow slower, are less likely to create jobs, and less likely to borrow to invest. So the other factor that contributes to productivity is management practice. So we measure quality of management in those firms, and basically the argument is indeed that in those firms, management quality has not increased and remains behind the competitors. And in that sense, we need to think what needs to be done better. We know that management practices are important drivers of better productivity. And in that sense, something should be done about that as well. We talk about how competition creates incentives for better management practices. We talk about how ownership matters. Government-owned firms are less likely to have good management practices, and in that sense, this is something that we discuss as well in the report in the detail. Now, we also talk about openness and innovation. These are important drivers of productivity growth as well. Firms that participate in cross-border trade are more likely to grow productivity and to be innovative. Overall, unfortunately, the region itself is behind the competitors on innovation and on participation in the global value chains. And in that sense, this is yet another margin of improvement. Now, remember that cross-border trade and innovation reinforce each other. If you're innovative, you're more likely to be competitive globally. But also, if you have access to global markets, you're more likely to have incentives to invest in innovation. And so the firms that are innovative and the firms that do participate in global value chains are actually doing very well. But unfortunately, in this region, there are relatively few of firms like that. So the other thing is digitization. So again, what we show here is that firms that digitize are doing better. So firms that use even very basic digital technologies, such as using email and websites, actually are more productive. And we show that adoption of digital solutions can increase total factor productivity substantially. So we argue that there is a scope for policy interventions to promote digitization that can also help productivity growth. Now, the other aspect of the report is looking not at productivity of factors, but accumulation of factors, mostly fixed capital and human capital. And so we talk about human capital accumulation, and we talk about how companies can offer training to workers, and that can actually help to increase productivity. Now, one of the interesting questions is to what extent training of workers and management practices substitute or complement each other, and we show that these are complements. So the better quality of management, the more formal training of workers, and vice versa. We also show that the tertiary education is an important driver of formal training to contribute to productivity growth. So in that sense, again, there is a policy implication that investment in tertiary education in the region can actually help formal training of workers to be more productive in firms. Now, another issue is investment in fixed assets. This is yet another factor of production. We look at investment, we look at access to finance. We do a very sophisticated analysis trying to understand to what extent firms that borrow and firms that don't borrow grow differentially. And of course, firms that don't borrow are sometimes firms that would like to borrow but can't. And so we discuss this distinction between autarkic firms, financial autarkic firms, firms that are shut out of financial markets. We talk about some of them being voluntary, firms that don't need the external funding, and those which are non-autarkic firms, non-voluntary autarkic firms. And we show that in many cases, firms would like to borrow, but high interest rates limit their access to finance, and therefore result in underinvestment. Unfortunately, high interest rates may be an implication of the issue that I mentioned in the very beginning, government borrowing, very high public debt. And in that sense, some of the micro problems are actually driven by macro challenges. And unfortunately, that's yet another policy implication that has to be addressed. Now, finally, one of the key issues of the report is the green transition. The region has not done very well in terms of reducing emissions, to put it mildly. And we look into this issue. We look into the issue of credit constraints and quality of management that help or slow down green transition. And overall, we find that there is a great potential for improving green management practices in investing in green technology. We also look at ESG responsibility indicator. Here on the slide, you can see that we go country by country, region by region. In this chart, we go region by region, where we actually decompose the ESG into three components: environmental, social, and governance, region by region. And you see that MENA region is not doing very well on environmental and social in particular. And that is yet another challenge for the region. Again, policy implication is that pricing of emissions should be there. Firms should have incentives to invest in green economy rather than get subsidies for using fossil fuels. Now, to summarize, in almost every single one of those 7 chapters, we see opportunities for improvement, to put it this way. In almost every dimension, there are aspects where MENA firms could have done better. On one hand, it's a it's a grim takeaway. On the other hand, it's an optimistic view, suggesting that if policies are improved, there is a potential for improvement for firms' productivity as well. And so the private sector can do better and should do better if policies are in place. What are kind of policy implications? We talk about governance issues related to the level playing field, removing the role of political connections. We talk about informal sector. We want to make sure that informal economy doesn't undermine the incentives of formal private sector to compete. We talk about openness to participation in global value chains, removing barriers to globalization. We talk about innovation that reinforces trade, but also is in its own turn reinforced by trade. The same is with digitization, which also works better in firms that work cross-border. These firms need digital solutions, and their productivity is promoted by digital solutions. And finally, we talk about management quality more generally, but also specifically about green management practices. And both of those are important for productivity growth and for green transition. So another thing which goes at the level of the macro policy is in order to improve access to credit, one of the big issues is to get interest rates right, and the other one is to remove fossil fuel subsidies. And in both cases, none of those solutions is easy, but they can go a long way. So I'm out of time. It's been exactly 15 minutes. So let me stop here and give floor back to Barbara. That's been a pleasure presenting this report. And I would like to thank every single author again, like Barbara did, for joint work on this wonderful report. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey, for giving us so much insight in a very short time. I'm sure your presentation will spark a lively debate, and we have with us today 4 distinguished speakers. Unfortunately, I will not have the time to do justice to their CVs that you can find in the chat. But please let me introduce them, starting with Roberta Gatti, Chief Economist for Middle East and North Africa at the World Bank. We then have Deborah Revoltella, who's the Chief Economist at the EIB, Ibrahim El-Badawi, Managing Director at the ERF, and Alexander Plekhanov, Director for Transition Impact and Global Economics at the Ebrd. Welcome all, and thank you so much for being here today. There are many angles that we could use to tackle the discussion, but I would like to frame it around the concept of capital. We've heard that investment is crucial in the MENA region, and so I think this could be a nice framework to analyze the results and the outcome of our analysis, and focusing on 3 components of capital, or 3 declensions of capital: environmental capital, human capital, and financial capital. And since climate change is really one of the key challenges of our time, I would like to start with this first. Sergey mentioned that the firms in the MENA region have still quite a long way to go in terms of green transition. And I would like to ask our panelists, and Alexander in particular, to elaborate a little bit on that. Where do the enterprises in the region stand, and what should government and IFIs do? Alexander.
Thank you. I think that the great thing is that the report and Sergey's presentation provide a wealth of data to actually frame thinking about these issues, green economy included. There is no magic bullet, I think, when we think about greening in MENA or elsewhere. It boils down to simple things. I think the most important of them are price incentives. And Sergey mentioned that. In fact, we have earlier work based on enterprise surveys that shows that actually if you have cheap pollution, good managers, cheap energy, good managers will just use more of it, because profit maximization is a simple business. You use cheap inputs to produce expensive outputs. Your energy is cheap, your pollution is cheap, you use a lot of energy and pollution. Now, can these subsidies actually be made better? Probably they can. Typical subsidies per unit of consumption, it encourages you to consume a lot. The report tells you that 2.5% of GDP a year is spent on average on these subsidies, but you could give this subsidy as a fixed amount per household. As a result, the marginal price that you pay for energy doesn't change, and the poor benefit a lot more, because for them, a little amount is a lot, for each a little amount is not a lot. So you don't have to necessarily teach subsidies, you could do greener subsidies, better subsidies. So the other thing that is very important is customer pressure. I think there was a question there on the chart. What has changed since 2016? Well, I think what has changed is we start today's discussion with green capital rather than human capital or physical capital. I think that would be unusual 10 years ago. There is a lot of pressure in societies where we live to talk about green issues. It comes through the narrative that gets repeated. People get educated, enterprises get educated. The report actually shows very clearly that it's not yet happening very much in the MENA region. And when we zoom in here on ESG credentials of the enterprises, they are weak. Then there is innovation and management. Green transition is just technological change in the right direction. But ultimately, it's technological change. It's about innovation. It's about management. Now, if you have weaknesses of governance, if you have a huge informal sector, if political connections matter a lot, when you select managers, you don't necessarily select them on the basis of expertise. You select people who you trust, who will not steal from you. You select people who are politically connected and so on. And as a result, if quality of management is weak, it's actually difficult to do green management. And then there are credit constraints. And here I think the report is great because it tells you also honestly that in this particular area, credit constraints matter less. Why? Because if all those other constraints are so binding, well, something has to be not very binding, and it shows in the data. So throwing more finance is important, but not necessarily the most important thing. Attacking structural issues is what we need to do in this region. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Alexander, also for being so disciplined with time. We will, I'm sure we will come back to this in our discussion. And I would like now to turn to human capital, the second dimension of capital I mentioned earlier. And we have a real expert in the room, Roberta. Based on the analysis that you've carried out and also your previous work, what is the state of human capital in the MENA region, and can formal businesses contribute to human capital in your view?
Barbara, you really asked a question after my own heart when you asked me to speak about human capital. So let me just provide a little bit of context and then move on to the interaction between human capital and the private sector. So the Human Capital Index, which was part of my previous job in a former capacity, is a measure that captures the productivity of a child born today in a country or in a region as a future worker, given the risk to health and education prevailing in her country or region. This number for MENA is 57, and it's actually 57% than a counterfactual productivity that could be calculated if there were zero risks to health and education. So what does that mean? It means that about 40% plus of productivity is lost because of risks to children not surviving, which is the most dramatic, children not being healthy enough to grow as healthy and productive worker, and children not going or not learning enough from school. In the Human Capital Index, we measure this future productivity from the age of, from birth to age 18. But we know that capital formation and accumulation continues over the life cycle. And so something that we try to develop is a measure of utilization of human capital, which we proxy essentially by the rate of employment in a country. So if we think that 57% is a low number already, then once we correct for the utilization of human capital, in MENA, we go down to 32%. I'm sure that all of us in this room and in the audience know why, and that is because primarily labor force participation and employment for women are very low. So when we talk about human capital in MENA, there is this sense, which both Sergei and also Alexander, Sasha conveyed, of potential that is left on the table, of money that is left on the table, potential that could be achieved, but that is not achieved. From the point of view of human capital formation in the early ages in MENA, shortfalls in learning are the main culprit. This is more the case increasingly for boys than for girls. And so again, you see something that resembles a paradox. Girls in MENA perform better than boys in schools, but then they participate much less in economic activity, something that gives us a sense of how much money is really left on the table. Now, the measure that I cited is 57% was pre-COVID. And then we know that the pandemic brought worldwide a massive shock in terms of formation of human capital, not last because a school closure was so extended. So from the point of view of context, there is a need for the region to invest in recouping the likely losses during the pandemics and really invest significantly in human capital. But also it's very important to invest in how this human capital is utilized. Now, let's get to the role of firms. Human capital accumulation, as I mentioned, happened over the whole life cycle. And the Nobel Prize winner Jim Heckman has estimated that about half of the accumulation of human capital happens during the working life. This can happen through more training or through on-the-job training. And so the quality of jobs really makes a big difference for how this human capital is accumulated. Sergei, when he was briefly touching upon the question of informality, really talked about the low productivity of jobs in our region. And one of the side effects of this productivity is that we see workers using much less of the non-routine cognitive skills that the literature, starting from David Autor and forward, has attributed to the jobs of the future. So through on-the-job learning, there is already a sort of relatively low and obsolete learning that is more associated to routine skills. And there is the role of firms that can actively invest in training of their workers. And here again, we see that MENA countries, as we see from the data in the survey, invest significantly less than comparators in formal training. Formal training in middle and large firms is only 29% of them in MENA provide training, compared to about 39% in Eastern and Central Asia countries. Now, what we find is interesting is that when firms have higher levels of university graduates, they provide more training. They could do so because that's a way to attract better workers, but they might do so because the education of tertiary educated young people might not be speaking to the skills that are needed in the firms. From other evidence, we know that the match between the relevance of education and the demand of firms is not perfect. And even from our data, we know that 20% of these firms complain of mismatch of skills as one of their strongest constraints. What this also speaks to is the fact that it could be the university graduates in countries where public employment continues to be the aspiration of young people, do not arrive at the labor market with the right skills and distort their studies to have the piece of paper, as we would call it in some countries, rather than the right skills. So concluding with some of the policy implications, yes, it's important to give incentives to firms to provide more training, particularly in labor markets where the labor mobility is relatively low, as we know that it is the case for MENA countries, because these firms would really appropriate the benefits of this training. At the same time, other reforms might be needed that increase competition, create more of a level playing field for firms to compete, because they will have more incentives to invest more in capital, more in innovation. And when you invest more in innovation, there's a strong complementarity with high skills that require formal training. So thank you, Barbara, and looking forward to the other interventions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Roberta. This is really insightful. And I would like now to turn to financial capital, last but not least. And I have a question for Ibrahim. The report, as Sergey told us just earlier on, looks at the financial conditions that firms are facing, and this is particularly relevant in the context of the ongoing tightening of monetary policy across the globe. So in your view, what are the consequences of high interest rate policies in MENA, especially for firms' competitiveness and for their effective participation in global value chain? What is the story there? Ibrahim, can you hear us? You are mute. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
There you...
Okay. Thank you, Barbara, for this interesting question, and also obviously for Sergio and colleagues from the collaborating institutions, the World Bank and the European Investment Bank and Ebrd. For coming together to put this very interesting survey and interesting report. I would like to make, this commentary is aimed to be complementary to the report itself, and perhaps maybe, some sort of a suggestion for future research using large scale firm level data across countries, especially if data happens to be available for a panel of set of countries, because I think the issue of the high interest rate is almost becoming like a development strategy for many countries in the MENA region, or in fact, it could be some sort of a de facto strategy of a failure to rein on fiscal policy and fiscal institutions, especially since the fiscal effort is actually quite low in almost all countries. In the case of the GCC, for example, because of the tremendous oil and gas resources, the impact is not really felt. But in resource poor countries, middle income and low income alike of the region, the interest rate policy have actually devastated the overall competitiveness of the economy, directly, obviously, through raising the cost of lending for firms, but equally importantly, indirectly, through kind of precipitating excessively strong currencies, or let me say, disequilibrium currencies that are likely to be overvalued given the current macroeconomic conditions in terms of trade and fiscal policy and saving, and so therefore, in terms of trade, so therefore, I think it's important to look more deeply into this issue, which is already, of course, discussed in the report, the high interest rate, and also there is a whole section on the overall macroeconomic scene and its consequences for firm export performance and competitiveness. But I think to the extent that the interest rate also generates this indirect impact on the exchange rate and makes it very difficult for firms to integrate into global value chain, especially forward integration, whereby the global value chain would outsource basic inputs from these countries, given or most of them, given their level of development. And so to the extent that actually these countries do not really have the comparative advantage of low cost because of the high exchange rate or overvalued exchange rate, this will make it harder for them, while at the same time, for them to be able to integrate backwardly into global value chain by adding value, they need a learning experience, starting with forward integration, before they can actually master the technology and productivity that will allow them to graduate from forward integration into backward integration. So I think perhaps maybe in the future, if comparable surveys like this one is available across country and across it's available across country, that can be available across time. This provides an opportunity really to combine both sectoral micro firm-based determinants of export performance, as well as economy-wide macro determinants such as the exchange rate and the interest rate. So this is basically the main point I wanted to highlight. And I want to say that actually the received literature suggests that actually combining these two sets of determinants can actually be quite informative and useful for policy. Just to give you an example, I have a paper that used a unique database from the World Bank covering Egypt, Jordan, Kuwait, and Yemen. It's custom data that allowed one to actually analyze the impact of exchange rate undervaluation as well as economic institution, along with firm level data at both the extensive and intensive margin. And we came up with some very interesting conclusions about the impact of the exchange rate depending on the size of firm, and also it tends to have a differentiated impact between the intensive margin and the extensive margin. So I will leave it here, but the main idea or the kind of the moral of my story is that this is a very important, interesting report, but perhaps maybe thinking ahead as in the future, perhaps maybe introducing macro fundamentals would be interesting and useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. And just staying for a moment on capital and on access to finance, Sergey told us that many firms in the region choose to be financially autarkic. Deborah, why do they do that? And is there a growth penalty for these firms that choose to stay away from the financial system?
Thank you very much, Barbara, and thanks to all for the very good comment that we heard thus far. And I think if I have to stay on the financing side and thinking about one of the main learning that I get from the whole report is that there are actually many barriers that reduce and impede firm investment and grow in the region. And actually, access to finance is probably not the one binding constraint for firms to invest. So it's not probably the binding one. We define the concept of financial autarky, and firms in financial autarky finance their working capital or the investment only from internal sources. They do not have loans outstanding, they do not have overdraft facility, and they do not use supplier credit. What is interesting is whether those firms choose to be in autarky or are forced in this condition, and then what this autarky does for their growth opportunity. And if we look at the data in the report, we see that actually autarky is an important phenomenon in the region. 37% of firms fall in financial autarky, and this is particularly an issue in countries like Egypt, Jordan, West Bank, and Gaza. And almost 80%, 79% of firms in autarky are actually voluntary autarkic firms. So they basically choose the state by themselves. And we also find in the report that the financial autarky is a function of both the firm characteristic and the business environment. You find that the usual suspect, autarky is higher for small and medium enterprises, young firms, firms that mainly focus on the local market, and the less sophisticated firms. We also see that the firms that operate in countries with a more developed business environment, in those countries, the share of autarky firms is lower. So the key question is whether by being autarkic, firms actually lose growth opportunities. And what we find, and actually this is what we find in the benchmark group of countries that we use in the report. So if we look at Europe and Central Asia, what we see is that actually firms that are in financial autarky, they lose growth opportunity. And we read it like existence of a finance gap that actually is explained also from the supply side of the supply of finance. In the MENA region, we don't see this element that being a financial autarky or voluntary autarky means losing opportunities. And the interpretation that we give is actually that low investment rates in the region are not explained by firm choices or firms' financial access. So at the end is what I was saying at the very beginning, access to finance, problems in access to finance are probably not the binding constraint. There are other constraints that are limiting firms' investment activities and firms' opportunity. And we very much relate it to the rest of the business environment and all aspects that have been mentioned already before. What does it mean in terms of policy? And I think that's quite important. Then it means that in terms of policy, only providing finance will not solve the issue. You have to combine finance with improvement of the business environment, and this has to come together. And then it means also working on addressing competition issues from political connection, the competition issues from the large informal sector, low managerial practice, and everything that we talked before in terms of business environment. But really the key message that I see is that access to finance is not the binding constraint. There are other constraints on the business environment that constitute a blockage for firms' development and growth.
Thank you, Deborah. There was indeed there is a comment indeed in the Q&A that says that there are issues of access to finance for firms, that in the region a lot of the lending goes to the reputable and well-connected firms, whereas the young and the small remain a little bit at the margin of the system. And of course, I think this, what you were just saying, we're not saying that access to finance is not an issue, but it's an issue in combination with many others. And another question that we have in the chat, and I will ask it to the four of you, and feel free to jump in, Sergey, you as well, is whether there is a link between firm size and productivity. Which firms, the question went, grow faster and are more productive. My sense is that there are many dimensions to be taken into account. It's not just firm size, but maybe I would leave it to you to elaborate a little bit on this. And also, since we're really running short of time, maybe if you want to wrap up with a quick word on what are the key, really the key message in a nutshell on and key takeaways and big question marks in terms of policy and research going forward in the region.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Let me indeed wrap up very quickly on this question. Yes, firm size is good for productivity, and it's an observation which happens everywhere, anywhere. And that's why we need to provide incentives for firm growth, which in turn are the ones that we indicate in the report. And before finalizing this, I would just say there are macro issues. We talked about that, about the need to maintain stable macroeconomic environment and lower interest rates, which are implications of that. And second, good micro policy, which means a level playing field, competition, good institutions. Incentives to invest in green technology, incentives to invest in digital technology, incentives for going beyond local markets. All of this matter, and this is a very obvious set of recommendations. The good news is some countries are doing better, and there is scope for learning from each other. And I guess that's why we do reports like this. We learn which countries are lagging behind, which countries are leading, and what can be learned by one country from another country. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey. Indeed, you touched upon the importance of institutions and institutional quality, which was one of a comment we have in our chat. And I see also a lot of the questions are being answered already in the chat by Helena, by Frank, and Asif. And thank you very much for taking these. I would quickly like to ask the others if they want to come in with concluding thoughts and remarks, and also tell the audience that our authors and our panelists are happy to be reached, also to get your comments and questions that we haven't managed to answer as yet. So Alexander, please.
Well, maybe just 30 seconds. I thought there was an excellent question on the chat, how a report like that compares with the now discontinued Doing Business report. And I think they are complementary and both very important, these approaches. The philosophy of Doing Business was to look at a representative firm and try to figure out if the firm were to follow all the regulations, how difficult it is to hire people, export, etc. But a representative firm, of course, is an artificial concept. So there is a lot to be gained by looking at the universe of firms, as this report does, and actually see what happens, what is the distribution of experiences. A representative firm may never face corruption, and yet there may be a lot of firms that face corruption and weaknesses of governance. So I think both approaches are very important.
Thank you. And I think there was also a reply in the chat. Roberta, Deborah, do you have any concluding thoughts?
Deborah, you first.
Muted. Okay.
Okay. On my side, I just
very briefly.
Yeah, on my side, I also wanted to mention, I think the concluding thought is really this distortive effect of the business environment that constrain opportunities for firms. And this is also visible in terms of the low level of innovation and the reduced capacity of firms to leverage from the positive effect of being a part of the global value chain. There are again success stories, but the pervasive effect of the business environment of firms is seen in many parts of the report and is highlighted in many areas, and addressing the issue of the region at the micro and at the macro level requires really dealing with this pervasive effect.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm also conscious of time because we still have one speaker and Heike needs to leave relatively quickly. So I would please ask Roberta and Ibrahim if they want to say a final word, to be brief.
I'll be very brief, Barbara, and I would like to use my 15 seconds to make a plea for better data. So more and better data is particularly important for the MENA region. I think that this survey is a trove and a wealth of information for research and policy, but it doesn't answer all questions. For example, questions of productivity could be better answers with the business census, but only very few countries in the region collect such data and make them available. So my plea is to policymakers and ministries to invest in data collection. It is helpful not only to understand and diagnose what's going on, but also for you to make sense of policies and decide what to do. So thank you.
Thank you, Roberta. And we
would also add,
your plea.
Yeah, Ibrahim. Let me also add, just to endorse Roberta's plea, I think it's very important, and we at the ARF, we are extremely concerned and interested about building the micro database. And one issue that I think probably for the future is the impact of digitech economic order on the ability of firms to absorb labor. Obviously, big firms can continue to produce at high productivity and even improve, but there are questions about the extent to which manufacturing can become a base for absorbing large quantity of labor, especially semi-skilled and unskilled labor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. And so I would like to welcome Heike Harmgart, Managing Director for the Southern and Eastern Mediterranean region at the Ebrd. Thank you for your patience. And she will close our session today with some closing remarks. Heike, the floor is yours. And thanks again for your patience.
No, thank you, Barbara. It was a fascinating discussion, and I really don't pretend that I will be able to summarize, the depth of comments that everyone has given, and the analysis, the richness that's in this data that was collected, and the collaboration efforts that the three institutions and all the researchers have done. So at one point I was getting a bit nervous when, the lack of financial constraints was mentioned, and I just got out of an Ebrd board meeting with some new credit lines for Egyptian banks. But luckily, one of them is on green finance and one of them is in women in business. And so I actually was quite happy to see that it is indeed the interface of many of these areas that, the speakers and the research was mentioned that is critical, and not just the financing constraints. So what can be done to really unlock growth in the region for the private sector? I mean, you see in the report and in the discussion, in particular, lowering regulatory barriers as important, promoting competition and reducing disincentives emerging from political influence and informal businesses. But I also really want to highlight the importance of facilitating innovation. In particular, we just heard again on digital technologies, human capital, but then actually what we kicked it off with Alexander's comments on green. So we really see that greening MENA countries is important, and their sound public policies, strong institutions, determined political leadership is important, and the right incentives that we also discussed in some of the comments later on. And I have to say, what better year than this year when COP27 will be hosted in Sharm el-Sheikh, which will, be just not just the stage for the global climate discussions, but also for Egypt and the MENA region. Egypt says it's a COP for Africa, it's a COP for the MENA region, it's a COP for implementation. So I think what better year than for all of us to work together and support hopefully willing political leadership in this region to help on greening the economy. So on focusing on industries and firms on a zero carbon future, while refraining from propping up so-called, greenwashing zombie firms that will struggle in the green economy, but actually fostering innovation in a region where we have seen record prices of low solar and wind energy costs. So I think I just plead to use the policy lessons and reforms from this report and work together with governments to implement these key areas and align all our joint goals with the Paris Agreement. So a big plea, and I hope that in November we see each other in Sharm el-Sheikh and we have some success stories to celebrate where really innovation, finance for the MENA countries come together with policymakers in facilitating really a green transition, a digital transition, a transition for human capital for this really important region. And with this, super happy to have been part of this discussion here from Cairo. Thank you very much to a fabulous report and from my perspective, a super fascinating discussions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Heike, and thank you all, Roberta, Alexander, Ibrahim, Deborah, Sergey, who had to leave, and thanks to our audience for the lively discussion, which somehow went on in parallel on the chat. I think we did a relatively decent job in answering the questions, but like I said, if there's anything that remains unaddressed, feel free to reach out to us, read the report, read the papers. A big thank you to the ERF for hosting us, and let's hope to meet in Cairo in person next time. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Bye.